If you had walked through Blackwood Valley on a rainy afternoon, you probably would have ignored the old man sitting beneath the ancient clock tower. Everyone else did. For 30 long years, he sat on the same weather-beaten wooden bench, the same worn gray coat, the same black umbrella resting beside him. And always, the same antique golden pocket watch resting quietly in his wrinkled hand. The watch never moved. Its cracked glass reflected the cold rain, while its tiny hands remained frozen forever. 15. The people of Blackwood Valley had created dozens of stories about the mysterious old man. Some believed he had lost the love of his life. Others whispered he had gone insane after a terrible accident. Children called him the Clock Man. Tourists often stopped to ask the same question. "Sir, why do you always stare at that broken watch?" The old man would smile gently, a tired, peaceful, almost heartbreaking smile. Then he would quietly answer, "It stopped on the saddest day of my life." Everyone believed the story. Everyone felt sorry for him, and that was exactly what he wanted, because the story was a lie. A perfect 30-year lie. The watch hadn't stopped because of heartbreak. It had stopped the exact second someone's blood covered it. And that blood belonged to the only woman Edward Vance had ever loved. 30 years earlier, Edward Vance wasn't an old man. He wasn't poor. He wasn't forgot. At only 34 years old, he was considered one of the brightest cybersecurity engineers in America. People described him as a visionary. A man capable of building technology years ahead of its time. His business partner, Arthur Pendleton, was equally brilliant. At least, that's what everyone believed. Together, they founded a small technology company inside a renovated warehouse overlooking Blackwood Harbor. The company's name was Aegis. Most people thought Aegis created security software. Only a handful of investors knew the truth. Edward had secretly designed an adaptive encryption system capable of protecting and controlling enormous financial networks. Banks wanted it. Governments wanted it. Investment firms competed to buy it. Within 2 years, their tiny startup became worth billions. Newspapers called them the future of digital security. Edward wasn't interested in becoming famous. He only wanted a peaceful life with his wife, Clara. She was the opposite of him, warm, cheerful, always laughing. Whenever Edward buried himself inside computer code for hours, Clara would quietly enter his office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She would kiss his forehead and smile. "You'll forget to eat again," Edward always laughed, "and you'll always remind me." That was enough. Money never impressed them, power never tempted them. They simply wanted a quiet future together. Arthur wanted something very different. He wanted everything. Success changes people, sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight. Edward noticed the change almost immediately. Arthur began arriving at meetings surrounded by expensive lawyers. Luxury watches replaced simple ones. Private helicopters replaced ordinary flights. He started making decisions without consulting Edward. Then one evening, Arthur entered Edward's office carrying a thick folder. "We've received an offer." Edward looked up. "From who?" Arthur smiled. "A private investment group. They'll pay us $8 billion. Edward frowned. "They want complete ownership," Arthur nodded. "They'll control Aegis." Edward closed the folder. "No," Arthur blinked. "No, we built Aegis to protect people. I'm not selling it to people we know nothing about." Arthur's smile disappeared. $8 billion, Edward. "I don't care if it's 80 billion. My answer is still no." Arthur stared at him for several long seconds, then smiled again. A smile that looked polite but never reached his eyes. Think about it. Edward never realized that conversation sealed his fate. Over the following months, things became strange. Important files disappeared. Financial reports no longer matched company records. Employees Edward had trusted for years suddenly resigned without explanation. Whenever he questioned Arthur, Arthur always had an answer. "It's probably an accounting mistake," or "the legal department is handling it," or simply, "Don't worry." Edward wanted to believe him. After all, Arthur wasn't only his business partner. He was his oldest friend. Sometimes, the people closest to us become the ones we understand the least. Then came October 14th. Rain hammered Blackwood Valley from early morning. The streets looked almost deserted. At exactly 3:40 p.m., Edward received an urgent phone call. Arthur sounded panicked. "Edward, we've got a security breach. They're inside the Blackwood vaults. We need you immediately." Without hesitation, Edward grabbed his coat and rushed toward company headquarters. He never noticed that someone else had already begun another operation. Across town, 3 armed men quietly approached Edward's house. Clara was home alone. She had just finished baking Edward's favorite apple pie. She smiled as she placed it on the kitchen counter. She had no idea that within minutes, her entire world would disappear. At exactly 4:15 p.m. Edward reached the underground vault. Instead of Arthur, federal agents were waiting, weapons drawn. "Edward Vance, don't move," he froze. "What?" Before he could react, they forced him onto the concrete floor. Cold steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "What is this? There has to be some mistake." One of the agents threw a classified folder onto the ground. Inside, every stolen government document, every illegal transfer, every cyberattack carried only one digital signature: Edward Vance. His heart nearly stopped. "No, I didn't do this. You've got the wrong man." Nobody listened. Then Edward heard another voice through a nearby police radio. A terrified officer shouted, "Additional units requested. Shots fired. Civilian female critically injured. Location." The officer read Edward's address. Every drop of blood drained from Edward's face. "Clara," he whispered. "No." He lunged toward the radio. The agent slammed him back onto the concrete. He screamed louder. "CLARA," no answer. Only static, and rain beating against the steel ceiling above. 30 minutes later, still wearing handcuffs, Edward was taken to his home. Blue police lights flashed across the neighborhood. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. Paramedics slowly wheeled a covered stretcher toward an ambulance. Edward recognized the silver bracelet hanging beneath the white sheet. It belonged to Clara. Everything inside him broke. He fell to his knees. "Please, no, please wake up." Nobody allowed him near her. As detectives photographed the scene, Edward noticed something lying near the front steps. His birthday gift. The antique golden pocket watch Clara had given him only 3 weeks earlier. It lay cracked on the rain-soaked pavement. Covered in blood, its tiny hands had stopped forever. 4:15. Edward closed his eyes. At that exact moment, he unknowingly made a promise, not to the police. Not to the court, not even to Clara, he made it to himself. One day, no matter how many years it took, the man responsible for this would lose everything. Not quickly, not mercifully. But one piece at a time, just as Edward Vance had. 3 days later, every television network carried the same headline. Aegis co-founder Edward Vance charged with treason, cyber-terrorism, and multiple counts of murder. And standing before dozens of cameras, pretending to wipe away tears, was Arthur Pendleton. Edward watched from inside a prison transport vehicle. Arthur looked directly into the cameras and said, "Edward Vance betrayed everyone who trusted him. Justice must be served." The prison bus slowly pulled away. Edward never looked away from the television screen, not because he believed Arthur, but because, for the first time, he saw the face of the man he would spend the next 30 years waiting to destroy. The prison gates closed behind Edward Vance with a deafening metallic crash. That single sound marked the official end of his old life. Inside those concrete walls, nobody cared whether he was innocent. To the guards, he was inmate 41,728. To the newspapers, he was America's most dangerous cybercriminal. To the world, he no longer existed. Only one person knew the truth: Arthur Pendleton. And Arthur made sure the truth stayed buried forever. Within 6 months of Edward's imprisonment, Arthur became the sole owner of Aegis Technologies. The media praised him as a visionary entrepreneur. Magazine covers called him the man who saved American cybersecurity. Television hosts applauded his courage. Politicians shook his hand. Universities awarded him honorary degrees. Every billion he earned, every award he accepted, every standing ovation he received, was built upon Edward's stolen life. Meanwhile, Edward slept inside a 6-foot prison cell. Every morning began before sunrise. Every night ended with silence. He was beaten more than once, thrown into solitary confinement. Denied books, denied visitors, denied hope, but they failed to take away the only thing he truly possessed, his mind. Most prisoners counted days. Edward counted mistakes. Every night, he replayed October 14th in his head. Every conversation, every meeting, every financial report, every email Arthur had ever sent. Tiny details nobody else would notice. Slowly, the impossible became obvious. Arthur hadn't simply betrayed him. Arthur had spent years building the perfect trap. Fake bank transfers, forged security logs, manipulated witnesses, bribed investigators, purchased judges. Every move had been carefully calculated. Edward finally understood something terrifying. He had never lost by accident. He had been sacrificed. 25 years later, the prison gates opened once again. Edward stepped outside carrying only 2 things, a small duffel bag and Clara's broken pocket watch. The prison officer handed him an envelope. Good luck. Edward simply nodded. Luck had nothing to do with what came next. Most people expected Edward to disappear. Instead, he returned to Blackwood Valley. Nothing looked the same. The old factories had become luxury apartments. The waterfront had transformed into expensive restaurants. And towering above everything stood Pendleton Tower, 65 floors of glass and steel. Arthur's name stretched across the top in giant silver letters. Edward looked at the building for nearly a full minute, then smiled. Big buildings, he whispered, cast long shadows. Over the next 5 years, Edward became invisible. He rented a tiny apartment under a different name. He bought second-hand clothes. He allowed his beard to grow. He deliberately walked with a cane. Every afternoon, he sat beneath the old clock tower, always carrying the same broken watch. People ignored him. That was exactly what he wanted. Invisible people hear everything. Business executives talked while walking through the park. Lawyers discussed confidential meetings. Security guards complained about schedules. Drivers argued on the phone. Nobody noticed the quiet old man feeding pigeons nearby. Every conversation, every routine, every weakness, Edward stored inside his memory. Slowly, a map began forming. Arthur's empire looked untouchable, but Edward knew something nobody else did. Because 30 years earlier, when Aegis was still nothing more than lines of code, Edward had secretly designed one final protection. A hidden administrative pathway. Not a virus. Not malware. A silent emergency protocol. It could never be activated from outside, only by the original architect. Arthur never found it, because Arthur had stolen the company. He had never truly understood it. Edward spent 4 years rebuilding what prison had almost destroyed. Using public libraries, old computers, open-source networks, and forgotten contacts who still believed in him, he quietly assembled evidence. Former employees, retired accountants, disillusioned executives. One by one, people who had once feared Arthur started talking, because powerful men rarely hide every crime. Eventually, someone always remembers. One rainy evening, Edward entered an abandoned warehouse near the harbor. Waiting inside were 6 people: a retired federal investigator, a forensic accountant, a cybersecurity analyst, a former Aegis programmer, an investigative journalist, and William Graves, the only lawyer who had refused Arthur's money 30 years earlier. William looked at Edward and smiled. "I've waited a long time for this meeting." Edward placed a thick folder onto the table. "This is only the beginning." Inside were thousands of documents, hidden financial records, secret offshore transfers, bribery payments, encrypted emails, audio recordings. Every page connected Arthur Pendleton to crimes spanning 3 decades. The room fell silent. Finally, the retired investigator spoke. "If even half of this is authentic," William finished the sentence, "Arthur Pendleton's empire is already dead." Edward quietly nodded. "It is authentic. I spent 30 years making sure." Over the next several months, the team worked in complete secrecy. Nothing leaked, nothing moved too early. Every document was independently verified. Every witness was protected. Every financial trail was traced. Edward refused to rush. He had already waited 30 years. He could wait a little longer. Because real justice is patient. Then came the final piece. One evening, William entered the warehouse carrying a sealed envelope. Without saying a word, he handed it to Edward. Inside was the original partnership agreement between Edward and Arthur. Edward stared silently at the faded signatures. Then his eyes stopped on one forgotten paragraph. Arthur had overlooked it for 3 decades. One sentence, one clause, one fatal mistake. It read, "In the event of proven fraud by either founding partner, all ownership rights, patents, intellectual property, and executive authority shall immediately revert to the innocent founding partner." Edward slowly closed the document. For the first time in 30 years he laughed, not loudly, not proudly, quietly, because Arthur had unknowingly written the weapon that would destroy himself. 3 days later, Arthur Pendleton stood before hundreds of reporters. Flashing cameras surrounded him as he announced the construction of a luxury skyscraper on the land where the old Blackwood clock tower stood. "Our city deserves a brighter future," Arthur declared confidently. The crowd applauded. Watching from a nearby park bench, Edward checked his pocket watch. Still frozen. 4:15. Then he looked at his wristwatch. 3:59 p.m. Exactly 1 minute remained. Edward slowly stood up. Across the street, Arthur began walking toward the park, surrounded by armed security. Rain started falling once again. Edward slipped one hand into his coat pocket, not to pull out a weapon, but to press a single button on his phone. Somewhere across the country, dozens of encrypted files began uploading simultaneously to federal agencies, financial regulators, and every major international news organization. 30 years of silence ended with one touch. Edward looked up as Arthur finally recognized the old man beneath the clock tower. Arthur stopped walking. Their eyes met. And for the first time in 30 years, Arthur Pendleton looked afraid. Rain poured across Blackwood Valley. Cold, heavy, unforgiving. The old clock tower stood silently over the empty promenade, exactly as it had 30 years earlier. Only 2 men truly understood what today meant. One had spent 30 years stealing everything. The other had spent 30 years taking it back. Arthur Pendleton stopped several feet away from the old bench. His bodyguards immediately surrounded him. The old man slowly stood. Gone was the weak posture. Gone was the trembling hand. Gone was the broken old stranger everyone had ignored for years. Edward Vance stood straight. His piercing blue eyes never left Arthur. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Arthur whispered, "Edward, I watched you go to prison. I attended Clara's funeral. I made sure your name disappeared forever." Edward smiled faintly. "You forgot one thing," Arthur frowned. "And what was that? You forgot that innocent men have nothing to lose." Arthur forced himself to laugh. "So what now? You think showing up here changes anything? I'm still Arthur Pendleton. I own half the city." Edward quietly reached into his coat. Every guard instantly drew their weapons. Edward ignored them. Instead, he removed nothing more than Clara's old golden pocket watch. Still frozen. Still showing 4:15. Arthur looked at it, then suddenly remembered. The blood, the rain. The screaming, for the first time in decades, his confidence cracked. Edward looked down at the watch. "You remember now." Arthur remained silent. "You thought prison would erase me. You thought time would erase Clara. You thought money would erase the truth." Edward slowly closed the watch. "But time remembers everything." Arthur suddenly shouted, "Shoot him!" 4 guards raised their pistols. Before anyone could move, every phone around them vibrated simultaneously. Arthur's phone, his attorney's phone, his chief of security's phone, even the reporters covering the groundbreaking ceremony nearby. Notification after notification flooded every screen. Breaking news: federal authorities raid Pendleton Global Headquarters. Another alert. U.S. Justice Department, FILES multiple criminal CHARGES. Another. International bank accounts frozen. Another. Pendleton stock, PLUNGES 87%, In pre-market trading, Arthur stared at the screen. His hands began shaking. "No, no, this isn't possible," Edward calmly replied. "It already happened." Across the city, federal agents entered Pendleton Tower. Employees poured into the streets carrying boxes. Servers were seized, hard drives confiscated. Financial investigators occupied every floor. Live helicopters circled overhead. Every major news network interrupted normal programming. Arthur's face appeared across giant television screens. Media billionaire under federal investigation, 30 years of corporate fraud. Exposed former partner cleared after DECADES people everywhere watched. The empire Arthur had spent 30 years building collapsed in less than 30 minutes. Arthur looked at Edward. "What did you do?" Edward answered calmly. "I didn't destroy your empire. I simply revealed the truth." One bodyguard lowered his weapon, then another. The chief of security removed his earpiece. "Sir, we've received orders." Arthur turned toward him. "What orders?" "We're no longer authorized to protect you." Arthur stared in disbelief. "What?" The guard slowly removed his security badge. "Our contracts have been terminated." Without another word, the entire security team walked away. Arthur was standing alone. For the first time in his adult life, a convoy of black SUVs entered the park. Their lights reflected across the rain-soaked pavement. Doors opened. Federal agents stepped out. Behind them came detectives, financial crime investigators, and finally, United States Marshals. The lead marshal approached Arthur. "Arthur Pendleton, you are under arrest." Arthur stumbled backward. "You don't understand." "I can explain." The marshal remained expressionless. "You may explain everything in court." As agents secured his hands with handcuffs, television cameras captured every second. The same cameras Arthur had once used to celebrate his success now broadcast his downfall to the entire world. Arthur looked desperately toward Edward. "Please, don't do this." Edward slowly walked closer. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. He leaned toward Arthur and quietly said, "30 years ago, I begged too. You didn't listen." Arthur closed his eyes. For the first time, he finally understood. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. William Graves approached carrying another leather folder. "Edward, it's finished." Edward opened it. Inside lay a single document. United States District Court Edward Vance full exoneration, every conviction vacated, every criminal charge dismissed. Officially, legally, completely. Edward gently touched the paper. 30 years reduced to one signature. He looked toward the gray sky. "Clara, we're finally free." Then something remarkable happened. The heavy bell inside the old clock tower suddenly echoed across Blackwood Valley. Clang, 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 the massive clock hands slowly began moving. They reached 4:15. Edward looked at Clara's old pocket watch one last time. Carefully, he opened the back cover. Hidden inside was a tiny winding key. The same key Clara had shown him decades earlier. He smiled. Then gently turned it. Tick, tick, tick. For the first time in 30 years, the watch came back to life. Its hands moved past 4:15, 4:16, then 4:17. Time had finally begun again. Edward quietly placed the watch inside his coat pocket. He looked once more at Arthur being escorted toward the waiting vehicles. Arthur never looked back. Neither did Edward. Because some chapters deserve to end forever. 6 months later, Blackwood Valley looked different. Pendleton Tower had been sold. The proceeds from Arthur's seized assets helped compensate victims identified during the investigation. The old clock tower remained exactly where it belonged. No skyscraper ever replaced it. Each afternoon, visitors still noticed an elderly gentleman sitting quietly on the same wooden bench. But now, he wasn't waiting. He was simply enjoying the rain. Sometimes children asked, "Sir, does your watch still work?" Edward smiled, pulled the golden watch from his pocket, held it toward the light, and listened to its gentle rhythm. "Tick, tick, tick, it does now," he answered softly, because justice finally gave time permission to move forward. Edward closed the watch, stood from the bench, and slowly walked into the quiet streets of Blackwood Valley, not as a prisoner, not as a forgotten man, but as someone who had finally reclaimed the only thing no amount of money could ever buy. His life. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more emotional, suspenseful, and unforgettable revenge stories, don't forget to subscribe to Evelyn Tales and stay with us for the next story.